Welcome to Reddit Aliens. What have you witnessed that will haunt you forever? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. X-ray tech here, but I was a student at the time, called to ER for trauma code. Only know it's a pediatric patient. The terror is I walk around the corner and see it's a little boy, same size as my son. We go to take an X-ray, and he's making this high-pitched, shrill wheezing noise. They couldn't intubate en route, so we were doing a chest-neck to see what was going on. His neck was full of air. Come to find out the story later, he had tripped and fallen in school, and his neck went square on a desk, and he had broken his trachea. Believe he was stabilized and flown out. Never found out what happened after. ER nurse. This won't haunt me in a bad way, but it'll stick with me for sure. We were coding a middle-aged lady we knew was going to die. We were pulling out the last-ditch stuff, hoping we'd get lucky, but everyone knew which way it was going. Family was there and in the room. When it was clear we had run through all of the Hail Marys, and it was time to call it, the husband spoke up for the first time. He had apparently been an EMT for a long time, so he knew what he was looking at. He said he was going to do the final round of compressions. It was very respectfully done. He got up, did his 2 minutes. The nurses quietly started turning things off so there wouldn't be continuous alarms. We called for a pulse check, which the husband did. Then we called time of death. He was thankful we let him do that, and I was thankful to be a part of it. For such a sad moment, this was actually very sweet. Bittersweet, I'm sure, but yeah. Not me, but my roommate's fiance is a flight nurse. She told me this story around Easter. They showed up to a scene being told beforehand that there was a patient with a gunshot wound and bleeding bad, but that's all they were told. When they got there, they found a woman who was sitting on the ambulance gurney, completely lucid and looking around, completely missing her lower jaw. She said you could see down her throat, and she looked like a zombie. Her lower jaw was hanging to the side by some tissue, and when she looked about, it swung around and dangled. She said the woman seemed relatively calm, and when she tried to speak, what was left of her tongue kind of moved, but nothing gurgles came out. It was not a suicide. Her boyfriend accidentally discharged his firearm while they were in his car. She survived. Retired RN. I was working in the PACU and helped another nurse take her patient to his room. As I was adjusting something by his head, he grabbed my hand and started crying. He kept saying, "I don't want to die." He was barely 20. In an isolation room. I looked into his eyes and tried to comfort him as he sobbed. This was in the early days of the AIDS epidemic. He died within a week. To this day, I still see his eyes and hear him sobbing. I live next to a busy street. In between lanes is a tram station. Teenager wanted to cross and got run over by a tram. Well, partly run over. He ended up with his body squeezed in between the tram and the tram station wall, with his legs stuck under the tram. It took about 1.5 hours until they had the equipment to lift the tram to get him out of there. They managed to reanimate what was left of him, but he died in the hospital. I found my roommate's body in our apartment when I was in college. He had suffocated himself with a helium tank and a plastic bag over his head. That effed me up pretty good, especially because I knew he was struggling with his mental health. He was cutting himself too. He tried to hide it, but I noticed, and I didn't say a word. I didn't offer a helping hand. I could have done something to help him, but I didn't. That guilt is still there, 10 years down the line. I was designated driver at a friend's 30th birthday party. Had just dropped off my last friend, and I was heading home. Little blue cars zipped by me going maybe 10 over. Maybe a block ahead of me, I see the speeding car hit two 20-year-olds who were running across the street. They were running to McDonald's across from the nightclub they were partying at and didn't wait for a red light. I'll never forget the girl's blonde hair and the bright headlights as she got hit. One thing that isn't ever correct in TV shows, when people get hit by cars, is how much damage it does to a human body. I distinctly remember her legs laying like 2 meters from his body. Both died right when paramedics got there. Watching my dad succumb to cancer in basically a week. It's a longish story, so I won't get into it, but the apex of the despair was when a friend of his who knew he was in the hospital and had seen him the week before came bounding into the room to see him, thinking he was just going to crack a couple of jokes, and then seeing the stunned look on his face when he realized that my dad had become nothing more than a human shell, blindly begging for water. I'll never forget that, or anything else about that weekend. I work in an emergency room as an ER technician going on 6 years now. I'm usually the one who puts deceased patients into body bags to transport to our morgue. I'll just say that toddlers get a hold of guns way more than you might think. Just a couple of weeks ago, a 4-year-old somehow found his mom's handgun and shot himself in the abdomen. I do not enjoy putting children into bags. I also feel terrible that I've become desensitized to it. I lived close to the Beirut explosion. Seeing dead bodies everywhere, I went, and not being able to contact my family really hit me. Was basically cleaning up and helping everyone who was injured. Many close friends of mine got injured, and some people died. I hope no one ever goes through the sheer terror that this day had on everyone affected. I still remember there were a lot of vibrations, so I started looking for my brothers, and next thing I knew, the wall in front of me was gone, and I was so lost. Thank God me and my family got off with very mild injuries. My dad has cancer and fainted today when me and my mom were helping him into bed. He had surgery twice, and one of his incisions broke open as he fell. His eyes stayed open, and I thought he was dead. The picture of my mom cradling him in a pool of blood while he stared into nothingness is burned into my brain. On my birthday about 4 years ago, I was waiting to catch the tram home from work. An elderly man standing next to me suddenly had a seizure and fell face forward. I won't ever forget the sound of his forehead smacking the concrete platform at force. Blood immediately started pooling, and when I turned him over, he started gasping and seizing again. Waited with him for 15 minutes before the ambulance came. It was Easter Sunday about 5 in the afternoon. I was driving home from the lake with a friend of mine on a country highway that's pretty well traveled. It's one of those single lane coming and single lane going where the speed limit is 70 roads. The intersections are far and few between, so instead of an overpass, it's just a blinking yellow caution light. In what literally felt like the blink of an eye, the car driving in front of me is struck on the driver's side door. The impact pushes both cars off of the road and onto the shoulder. I hit my brakes and was able to stop to help render aid. My friend and I get out of the car and run over to help. The driver's side door is crushed inward. Driver has been pushed into the passenger side. It was a younger lady, maybe mid-30s. The impact pushed her out of her seat and into her daughter. You even see movies where a dead body jump scares someone and it just stares at with wide eyes and mouth agape. Yeah, the girl is okay, but very confused. She has no visible injuries and is freely looking around, so we unbuckled her and pulled her out of the car, so she didn't realize her mom was laying on her. As we do it, I look at the mom and I can see a little life is left in her, so I said the only thing we could say: she's all right. You could see the light in her eyes fade, and she passes away. More cars stop and help out. As more people are here to help, I start to realize that someone has been screaming at me. In the back seat is her son. He must have been knocked unconscious, and he's now yelling, not out in pain, but asking, "Is mom okay? Is she okay?" I had no words for him. He was maybe 6. His sister was about 9. Thankfully, about 4 of the cars that stopped were off-duty first responders, so they quickly took over for me. This was about 20 years ago. I was 17 at the time, and I just saw mom die in front of her 2 kids. I'm crying now thinking back on it, and to this day I still refuse to ever take that road again. They finally built an actual stoplight a couple of years back. The area isn't more crowded, so I can only imagine what the motivation to improve that intersection was. Unfortunately, change usually only comes after some type of tragedy. I'm glad the kids were okay, but that's a rough one. I work as an ICU nurse at a level 1 trauma center. I'm used to seeing people die horribly pretty regularly. I work more in the medical ICUs. There was a case that's so bad, a death so long and horrible that I won't ever forget it. This poor guy, only in his 30s. He had been transferred to our burn unit from outside hospital because his wounds all over his body that needed extensive care. He was a larger guy, 250 pounds or so, had a total renal failure and needed hemodialysis, was HIV positive. He survived septic shock at the previous hospital, but was ventilator dependent via tracheotomy. He was able to communicate to us but not speak. He was aware of all what was going on. The wounds on his body were terrible. It was diagnosed as calciphylaxis, a rare skin condition that has a 1-year fatality rate of close to 50%. His condition affected most of his body by now. His wounds needed 3 to 4 nurses to change. They got worse and worse over time. We would bring rolls of gauze, 10 to 15 large burn pads. This was done twice daily. It was painful for him, and we would try and get it done as quickly as possible before the drugs we gave wore off. The smell was so bad, his flesh rotting. We would place toothpaste under our masks. Visitors for our other patients would complain about the smell. Necrotic flesh would slog off. One thigh had rotted away so bad you could see pulsation in his femoral artery. Again, he was awake and aware of this the whole time, but could only communicate with nods. He was unable to write, as wounds and high pressure requirements had eaten away at his fingers. His mother would visit often. She was nice but unrealistic in her expectations of him surviving. Eventually, he died of septic shock. We learned that he had contracted HIV as a toddler. He had been raped by a family member. The HIV and abuse was discovered when he went into renal failure at a young age. HIV can do that. Calciphylaxis is rare and poorly understood, but it almost exclusively found in people that have impaired renal function. His case was the worst human suffering I've ever seen. I operated a crematory for a little over a year and still have nightmares or visions of partially burned bodies from when I had to open the oven and scoop them around to make them burn more efficiently. I'll never forget the smell of what they looked and felt like. 12 years as a firefighter, I've seen some terrible things, but one night we get a call for a pedestrian versus a train, walking down the tracks on a bone-chill evening, and in the distance, I see what I believe to be a shoe. As I got closer, it turned out to be much more than a shoe. It was about half a leg, and this image is burned into my memory forever. Kids. I worked in the foster care system for a time, putting in my effort to be considered for fostering kids myself, and saw some effed up shit. Worst was always the bruised up children breaking down when forced to see parents who were rehabilitating, at least on paper, getting screamed at by drug-fueled abusive psychopaths while their poor kid was broken between wanting mom or dad, but scared to be near either. And this maybe caring stranger is taking them away from the devil they know. So yeah, beat up foster kids being real-time traumatized by meth and coke heads will stay with me. Was just about to turn 5 years old, was with my grandpas from both sides of my family and my stepfather. We were heading over to my stepfather's parents' place post to go pick up his tools and a couple dirt bikes he had stored away out in the utility garage on his parents' farm. I was all sorts of excited to see Grammy too during our visit. When we arrived, I jumped out of this beast of a square body and scampered my way inside to say hello to her. Heard Wheel of Fortune blaring through the hallway when I got inside. I knew she'd be in the living room all cozied up in her chair with a little bowl of bridge mix and a beer in hand. Instead, I found her headless in her chair, shotgun propped between her legs, and a big bloody mess to paint the scene. My parents told me and my younger brother very adamantly to play football in the back garden. I must have been 14. It was my mother's birthday, and I just thought we as kids were probably seeking too much attention, and maybe we should give my mother a break. So we played in the garden for a good half an hour. Then the inevitable happened. I kicked the ball into the neighbor's garden, and they weren't in. In England, our gardens were separated by a large hedge, and the only way to get into the neighbor's garden was to either knock on the front door or to go get my father to help me get the ladder to hop over the hedge and pass it over to the neighbor's garden whilst not destroying the shape of the hedge. No harm done. I thought it was fair game to pester my dad so we could continue playing on our own. The garden was fairly big, and looking around I couldn't see them. I then made my way inside, called out to my parents, nowhere to be seen. I thought maybe they had popped out at that point. I walk upstairs, and the first room to sweep and check was my parents' bedroom. The door was closed. I walk in, to a sight that is burned into my mind forever. My dad was straddled over my mum, pumping rounds. Obviously they were bonking, and after the shock, he sheepishly yanks the covers over him and says a line that is also burned into my brain because it was straight off the cuff brilliance in an awkward situation. Sorry, I'm just giving your mum a birthday present. Legend. Awful. And I'm scarred forever, but a definite legend. This story was very well received by me after reading some of the more tragic ones today. Traumatic as this would be, possibly more than the others, but still very funny. Great job. My father-in-law insisted on being home in his last days. We had hospice come to help him home, and I took some time off work to be with him. He was bedridden, so he had a catheter. He died in the middle of the night. I called the hospice nurse, and she got there before the ambulance did. Knowing my father-in-law, I wanted to have him dressed before the ambulance took him away. He would never have wanted to leave in the undressed state he was in. The nurse helped me to dress his dead body, but that's not the haunting part. She removed the catheter. The noise that it made when it came free, it was not pleasant. I remember my boyfriend at the time got into a mild motorcycle accident, called me to let me know where he was going to be at in the ER. I showed up at the hospital, and as I was there, I saw paramedics and everyone rush from the ambulance who had this guy who was covered in blood, just motionless. Paramedics, doctors yelling information, scattering, grabbing what they needed, and doing their absolute best to keep this person staying alive. Turns out, the guy was just a kid who turned 21. It was his birthday. That day, clearly was wasted when friends let him get behind the wheel, and driving, SMH, my heart just broke. Just remembering the smell of heavy blood and whatever else strong, possibly alcohol scent, and thinking of the horror the mother and parents must be in getting the news, shook me to my core, hoping my children will never have to be in a situation like that. I don't know if he survived or not, but it was just one of the sad things I remember witnessing. I don't know if it will haunt me forever, but it's something profoundly difficult to forget, and that would be my dying mother. I hadn't been on speaking terms with my parents for years due to a complicated situation. During that period of absence, my mother developed and fought off cancer, went into remission, relapsed, and then metaphorically fell apart at the seams from metastasis and comorbidities. I visited her on her deathbed. She was frail, unearthly thin. She didn't speak, she didn't react. When I looked into her eyes, I couldn't tell if she was looking back at me or looking through me. I couldn't tell you how much of her consciousness was left, if any. I remember the doctor telling me that I should speak to her because of consensus that hearing is the last sense to go. Apparently, I caught the tail end of what was her being in that state for over a week. A few days later, she finally passed. I don't like this inhumane zeal with which we approach the dying. I don't like that we force people to wither away and lose everything that makes us us, just because we want their hearts to keep beating a day longer, an hour longer, a minute longer. There's no dignity in that. It's selfish imposition on the dying. And it's something you never stop thinking about, really. What does it mean to die like that? It's like the Algernon and Charlie. Do you slowly begin to lose yourself and know it until the very end? Or does the consciousness go all at once and leave the primordial brain behind until its engine runs bare of coal? More importantly, did I truly speak my final words to my mother? Or had I simply whispered wasted breath to an empty shell? When I was 6, we lived in the Philippines. My dad was in the army and did some cool guy shit that came home a couple times. But what stuck with me was a package showed up at our house with no mailing label, so someone had dropped it in our mailbox. Being the nosy 6-year-old I was, I opened it to find a VHS tape. I put it in our player and turned it on, and it was a video of terrorists beheading someone I knew. It was a very sober and lucid moment for me. Don't think I'll ever forget the way the terrorist acted, as if it was like a game to them. I remember they offered him one last request, and he asked to see a picture of his family that he kept with him. They showed him the backside of it and laughed as they cut off his head. Ex-nurse here, so many things, haha. The one that stands out seems kind of banal, comparatively, but it was because of the situation. I was still in nursing school, and we were getting a tour of the ICU. It was basically a, see all these machines, baby nurses, don't touch anything. As we walked in as a group, a man in street clothes was sitting on the end of one of the beds, getting admitted for chest pains, we were told. He's the X machine, don't touch it. Here's the Y machine, don't touch it. Suddenly, we hear code blue ICU, and everyone starts rushing around. Man in street clothes had collapsed back onto the bed still in street clothes. They coded while we watched, but he didn't make it. Somehow, the fact that he was still in street clothes, laughing and joshing with the nurses, While they admitted him, that still haunts me. We as a group went to sit in the nursing lounge and cry. I went on to work for almost 20 years in ICU and saw some gruesome and horrifically sad things. But the thought of that guy thinking probably that he was getting admitted for what would probably be nothing or something fixable still bothers me. Trigger warning, suicide attempt. My brother had been acting strangely in public and cops had taken to a secure mental health unit. When I saw him, he was clearly psychotic and the hospital said they were going to discharge him. I begged for them to keep him as he was clearly very unwell. They didn't listen and said I needed to take him or they'd discharge him on his own. Concerned for his safety, I took him. My husband was studying to be a clinical psychologist, so I was somewhat reassured that he might be able to advocate in ways that I didn't know how. Anyhow, we thought, well, if they're not going to help, we'll take him to the psychologist that he'd apparently been seeing. We learned later this was a lie. As we get out of the car park and walk towards the clinic on the left, my brother veers right and yells, "F it," strips off his shirt, runs like mad up the path and jumps off the overpass onto the major arterial road below. It must have knocked him out cold. I heard lots of car tires screeching. I couldn't look. I sent my husband down. It felt like a good minute before my brother woke up and was screaming in agony. I was so upset, I couldn't ring an ambulance. I had to get bystanders to do it. When I saw him, he had fluid and blood pouring out of his ears, his nose and mouth. His head was misshapen at the back, broken skull. His injuries were severe. Brain injuries, broken skull, broken vertebrae, smashed pelvis, but miraculously recovered. I felt sick looking at him in the ER. I think his brain is still affected. He's still very much mentally ill, and always will be, schizophrenia and bipolar. He's lucky he survived, and with virtually no physical disability. Fortunately, I do not have PTSD from this one incident.